At 08:15 hours on April 12th, 1943, Oberleutnant Josef Wurmheller stood beside his Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft at Wevelgem airfield in occupied Belgium, studying the morning sky over the English Channel. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, conditions ideal for high-altitude interception missions against American bomber formations. Wurmheller was 24 years old, already an experienced fighter pilot with 43 confirmed aerial victories. He had fought over the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean, and now defended the Reich against the growing American daylight bombing campaign. The briefing that morning had been routine. American heavy bombers, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, were expected to attack targets in the Ruhr industrial region. Luftwaffe intelligence reported approximately 200 bombers would participate in the raid. Wurmheller's unit, Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen, one of the Luftwaffe's most prestigious fighter wings, would intercept the formations as they crossed into German airspace. The tactics were standard. German fighters would attack the bomber formations from head-on, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing into the vulnerable nose sections where the bombers had the least defensive armament. The attacks would be pressed home to close range, then the fighters would break away, climb back to altitude, and attack again. But intelligence officers had included an unusual warning in that morning's briefing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. American escort fighters had been appearing more frequently over the continent. Previously, American bombers had flown unescorted beyond the limited range of British Spitfires. German fighters could attack the bomber formations with relative impunity, suffering losses primarily from the bombers' defensive machine gun fire rather than from enemy fighters. That tactical situation was changing. The Americans had introduced a new fighter aircraft, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, designed specifically for long-range escort missions at high altitude. Luftwaffe intelligence reports on the P-47 were fragmentary and contradictory. The aircraft had appeared in combat over France and the Low Countries only in recent weeks. Initial encounters suggested it was large and heavy, powered by a massive radial engine. Some pilots reported it was fast in a dive, but sluggish in turning combat. Others claimed it could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. The armament was reported as 650 caliber machine guns, typical for American fighters. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine emphasized the importance of knowing enemy aircraft capabilities. German pilots were trained to exploit the weaknesses of specific Allied aircraft types. The Spitfire was highly maneuverable, but had limited ammunition and fuel capacity. The Hurricane was rugged, but relatively slow. American P-38 Lightnings were fast, but suffered mechanical problems at high altitude over Europe. Understanding the enemy's strengths and limitations was as important as knowing your own aircraft's capabilities. That morning's intelligence briefing on the P-47 reflected this analytical approach. The aircraft was assessed as a defensive escort fighter, capable of protecting bombers through its speed and diving ability, but not particularly dangerous in offensive combat against experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying the nimble Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, not because German intelligence officers were incompetent, but because they had made a fundamental error about the P-47's armament that would cost German pilots their lives throughout the coming air campaign over Europe. Wurmheller's Focke-Wulf 190A5 was one of the most capable fighter aircraft in operational service anywhere in the world in early 1943. The aircraft was powered by a BMW 801 14-cylinder radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower at takeoff. This massive engine drove a 3-bladed VDM constant-speed propeller 10 feet 10 inches in diameter. The radial engine configuration gave the Focke-Wulf exceptional reliability compared to liquid-cooled inline engines. A radial engine could lose several cylinders to battle damage and continue operating. There was no vulnerable radiator that could be punctured, causing catastrophic coolant loss and engine failure. The aircraft's armament consisted of two 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted above the engine, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc and four 20mm MG-151/20 cannons, 2 mounted in the wing roots and 2 in the outer wing panels. Total ammunition load was approximately 420 rounds for the machine guns and 880 rounds for the cannons. This armament package gave the Focke-Wulf devastating firepower against bomber formations. The 20mm cannons fired high-explosive incendiary shells weighing approximately 4.2 ounces each. These shells could penetrate aluminum aircraft skin and detonate inside the target, causing severe structural damage and fires. A single, well-placed cannon round could destroy an aircraft engine, rupture a fuel tank, or kill crew members. A burst of 3 or 4 rounds hitting a bomber could bring it down. German pilots were trained to attack heavy bombers from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire while maximizing the effectiveness of their own weapons. Head-on attacks from slightly above the bomber's flight path were particularly effective. The attacking fighter would approach at high speed, fire a short burst aimed at the cockpit and nose section, then dive away before the bomber's gunners could track and engage effectively. The entire attack lasted perhaps 3 to 5 seconds. In that brief window, an experienced pilot could destroy or severely damage a bomber. Wurmheller had executed this type of attack dozens of times. He knew precisely how to judge the closing speed, when to open fire, how long to hold the trigger, and when to break away. His 43 confirmed victories included 17 four-engine bombers, testimony to his skill at bomber interception. That skill, and the skills of hundreds of other experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots, would be tested against an opponent whose capabilities they fundamentally misunderstood. The American bombers appeared over the Belgian coast shortly after 1000 hours. Wurmheller's squadron scrambled from Wevelgem, climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. German ground controllers vectored the fighters toward the bomber stream using radio direction finding equipment and reports from ground observers. At 26,000 feet, Wurmheller spotted the American formation. Approximately 50 B-17 bombers flying in combat box formation, staggered boxes of aircraft designed to provide mutual defensive fire coverage. The bombers were still 30 miles from their target, deep inside German-controlled airspace, where escort fighters should not have been able to reach them. But there were escort fighters. Above and behind the bomber formation, Wurmheller could see fighter aircraft weaving back and forth across the bomber's track. Even at distance, the fighters were distinctive, large, heavy-looking aircraft with broad wings and bulbous engine cowlings, P-47 Thunderbolts. Wurmheller keyed his radio microphone and reported the sighting to his squadron mates. 9 Focke-Wulfs formed up into attack position, preparing to make head-on passes against the bomber formation. The presence of escort fighters complicated the attack, but did not fundamentally change German tactics. The escorts would try to intercept the attacking fighters, but if the Germans timed their attacks correctly and maintained formation discipline, most of them would get through to strike the bombers. The Focke-Wulfs accelerated into their attack run, diving slightly to build speed, then pulling up into a shallow climb that would bring them head-on to the lead bomber elements. Closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. The American bombers grew rapidly larger in Wurmheller's gun sight. He selected his target, a B-17 in the lead element, and prepared to fire. Range close to 800 meters, 700 meters, 600 meters. His finger tightened on the firing button. Then the American escort fighters dove. 4 P-47s rolled inverted and pulled through into near-vertical dives, accelerating rapidly as they fell on the attacking German fighters. Wurmheller saw them coming, but could not disengage. He was committed to his attack run, closing on the bombers at maximum speed. Breaking away now would mean aborting the attack and giving the escorts time to pursue with altitude and energy advantage. He held his course, fired a 3-second burst at his selected bomber, saw strikes on the aircraft's nose section, then pulled hard on the stick to break away beneath the bomber formation. As he rolled away from his attack, tracers lashed past his canopy. A P-47 had followed him through his attack and was firing. Wurmheller instinctively hauled his Focke-Wulf into a hard right turn, pulling maximum G-force, trying to force the pursuing American into an overshoot. The Focke-Wulf was famous for its roll rate, Faster than almost any Allied fighter, a skilled German pilot could reverse direction quickly, forcing an opponent to overshoot, then counterattack from a position of advantage. But the volume of fire from the pursuing Thunderbolt was unlike anything Wurmheller had experienced in air combat. Tracers filled the air around his aircraft, dozens of rounds passing within feet of his cockpit and wings. The sound was distinctive, a rapid hammering that seemed to come from multiple guns firing simultaneously. Strikes appeared on his left wing, explosive impacts that punched fist-sized holes through the aluminum skin. More strikes walked across his fuselage, one round penetrating the armor plate behind his seat with a sound like a hammer hitting steel. Wurmheller rolled hard left, reversed his turn, and dove away at full throttle. The Thunderbolt followed, still firing. More strikes hit his aircraft, one round severing his rudder control cables, another puncturing his oil cooler. Smoke began streaming from the engine cowling. The BMW radial continued running. But Wurmheller knew his aircraft was critically damaged. He broke off combat and headed west toward the Belgian coast at maximum speed, descending rapidly. The pursuing Thunderbolt did not follow. It broke away and climbed back toward the bomber formation, looking for other targets. Wurmheller nursed his damaged Focke-Wulf back to Wevelgem, landing with failing hydraulics and minimal control authority. As ground crew swarmed over his aircraft to assess the damage, he counted more than 30 separate hits from machine gun rounds. The left wing had multiple punctures. The fuselage was riddled with holes. The rudder control cables were completely severed. The oil cooler was destroyed. Several rounds had penetrated the armor plate protecting the cockpit. By all rights, he should have been dead or at minimum shot down. That he had survived was primarily luck. The Thunderbolt pilot had been firing at extreme range where accuracy was poor. Most rounds had missed. Those that struck had hit non-critical components or had been deflected by the Focke-Wulf's armor protection. But what disturbed Wurmheller most was the sheer volume of fire. Intelligence had reported that American P-47 fighters carried 6 50-caliber machine guns. The attack he had just survived involved far more than 6 guns. The rate of fire, the density of tracers, the number of strikes on his aircraft, all suggested a much heavier armament. When Wurmheller's squadron assembled for debriefing that afternoon, 3 aircraft were missing, shot down by American escort fighters. 2 more had returned with battle damage, severe enough to ground them for repairs. Of the 9 Focke-Wulfs that had engaged the bomber formation, only 4 remained combat-ready. The squadron had claimed 2 B-17 bombers destroyed and possibly damaged 3 more. But the loss of 3 experienced pilots and 5 aircraft for 2 confirmed bomber kills represented an unsustainable exchange rate. Other Luftwaffe units that engaged American bombers and their Thunderbolt escorts that day reported similar experiences. Pilots described being attacked by P-47s that produced overwhelming volumes of machine gun fire. Several pilots reported seeing tracers from multiple guns converging on their aircraft simultaneously. The consensus among German fighter pilots that evening was that something was very wrong with the intelligence assessment of the P-47's armament. The truth was that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, not 6. 4 guns were mounted in each wing, outboard of the landing gear. Each gun was loaded with approximately 425 rounds of linked ammunition, giving the aircraft a total ammunition load of approximately 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the Thunderbolt could deliver a weight of fire exceeding 100 pounds per second. This armament package was unprecedented for a single-engine fighter aircraft. The British Spitfire Mark V, the primary RAF fighter in 1942, carried 8 303 caliber machine guns. The later Spitfire Mark IX carried 2 20mm cannons and 4 303 caliber machine guns. The German Messerschmitt 109G carried 1 30mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. The Focke-Wulf 190A5 carried 2 13mm machine guns and 4 20mm cannons. No other operational fighter aircraft in the world carried 8 heavy machine guns. The design decision to arm the P-47 with 850 caliber guns reflected American tactical doctrine and manufacturing capabilities. American aircraft designers and military planners believed that concentrated machine gun fire was more practical than mixing machine guns and cannons. Machine guns had higher rates of fire, larger ammunition capacity, and better reliability than cannons. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was one of the most reliable automatic weapons ever manufactured. The gun could fire approximately 850 rounds per minute in aircraft installations. It rarely jammed. It could operate in extreme cold. At high altitude, maintenance requirements were minimal. American ammunition manufacturing capacity was virtually unlimited. The United States could produce 50 caliber ammunition in quantities that would have been impossible for cannon shells. A Thunderbolt, returning from a combat mission with empty guns, could be rearmed in minutes. The same aircraft armed with cannons would require more time to reload and would carry fewer rounds. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round used by American fighters was effective against aircraft at ranges up to 1,000 yards. The round could penetrate light armor, ignite fuel tanks, destroy engine components, and kill pilots. While it lacked the explosive power of a 20mm cannon shell, 850 caliber guns, firing simultaneously, could deliver devastating damage through sheer volume of fire. The Thunderbolt's designer, Alexander Kartveli, had specified 8 guns as the primary armament from the earliest design studies. The aircraft's large wing provided space for 4 guns per wing without compromising structural strength. The powerful Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine could carry the weight of the guns and ammunition without significant performance penalty. The result was a fighter aircraft that could literally fill the air with bullets during combat. But this capability was not immediately recognized by German intelligence. Early encounters with P-47 fighters over France and Belgium in March 1943 had been brief and inconclusive. German pilots reported seeing the new American fighter, but few had engaged in sustained combat. The initial intelligence assessment that the aircraft carried 6 guns was based on observation of gun ports in the wings, but observers had apparently counted only the visible ports on one wing and multiplied by 2. Not recognizing that each wing carried 4 guns. This error was compounded by the fact that Luftwaffe intelligence analysts expected American fighters to follow British armament patterns. British fighters typically carried 8 rifle-caliber machine guns, or a mix of cannons and machine guns. The concept of mounting 8 heavy machine guns on a single-engine fighter seemed excessive and inefficient to German analysts who were accustomed to different design philosophies. German fighter armament emphasized explosive shells from cannons rather than kinetic damage from machine gun bullets. This was partly driven by tactical requirements. German fighters attacking American bomber formations needed to destroy large, heavily built aircraft quickly before defensive gunners could return effective fire. Cannon shells could accomplish this. Machine gun bullets, even 50 caliber rounds, were less effective against 4-engine bombers. But American tactical doctrine for escort fighters emphasized different priorities. Escort fighters were designed primarily to shoot down enemy fighters, not bombers. Against fighter aircraft, the high rate of fire and large ammunition capacity of machine guns provided advantages over cannons. A pilot could fire longer bursts without depleting ammunition. Tracer rounds provided clear feedback on bullet trajectory, helping pilots adjust their aim during combat maneuvers. The guns could be harmonized, aimed to converge at a specific range, typically 250 to 300 yards, creating a concentrated cone of fire that increased hit probability. Josef Wurmheller survived his encounter with the P-47 on April 12th, but his assessment of the threat posed by American escort fighters changed dramatically. In his combat report, filed that evening, he emphasized the unexpectedly heavy armament of the Thunderbolt and recommended that all Luftwaffe fighter pilots be informed that the aircraft carried significantly more firepower than intelligence had indicated. His report was forwarded up the chain of command to Jagdfliegerführer Deutsche Bucht, the fighter command responsible for the defense of northwestern Germany. Within days, other combat reports from Luftwaffe fighter units began arriving at intelligence headquarters, all describing similar encounters with heavily armed P-47 fighters. Pilots reported being attacked by Thunderbolts that produced extraordinary volumes of machine gun fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Several pilots described seeing continuous streams of tracers rather than individual rounds. The cumulative weight of these reports forced intelligence analysts to revise their assessment of the P-47's capabilities. By late April 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence bulletins distributed to fighter units included updated information on American escort fighters. The P-47 was now assessed as carrying 850 caliber machine guns with a total ammunition capacity of over 3,000 rounds. Pilots were warned that the aircraft could maintain sustained fire for approximately 25 seconds if all guns fired continuously, far longer than German fighters could sustain cannon fire. The tactical implications of this correction were significant, but not immediately acted upon. Luftwaffe fighter tactics against American bomber formations continue to emphasize head-on attacks followed by breakaway dives. These tactics remained effective against the bombers themselves, but they exposed German fighters to counterattacks by escort fighters during the vulnerable breakaway phase. German pilots, finishing their attack runs against bombers, would dive away at high speed with little energy, remaining for defensive maneuvers. American escort fighters positioned above the bomber formations could dive on these breaking German fighters using altitude and speed advantage to close to firing range quickly. The P-47's 8 machine guns made these attacks devastatingly effective. An American pilot diving on a German fighter from above and behind could open fire at 600 yards and walk his fire forward toward the target through corrections based on tracer trajectory. Even if most rounds missed, the sheer volume of fire meant that multiple strikes were likely. German aircraft were designed to withstand significant battle damage, but concentrated machine gun fire could destroy critical components, kill pilots, or cause sufficient damage to force German fighters to break off and return to base. The loss rates among Luftwaffe day fighter units increased steadily through the spring and summer of 1943 as American escort fighters became more numerous and their pilots gained combat experience. Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen, Wurmheller's unit, lost 23 pilots killed or captured between April and August 1943. 11 of these losses were attributed to American escort fighters rather than bomber defensive fire. Other Luftwaffe fighter wings defending the western approaches to Germany reported similar casualty patterns. The presence of long-range escort fighters fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of daylight air combat over Europe. Previously, Luftwaffe fighters could attack American bomber formations with relative freedom, accepting casualties primarily from defensive gunner fire. Now, every attack on a bomber formation meant running a gauntlet of escort fighters armed with overwhelming firepower. German pilots had to watch for threats from above and behind while simultaneously pressing attacks against the bombers. The cognitive workload increased dramatically. Situational awareness became more difficult to maintain. Mistakes became more costly. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of Jagdgeschwader 54, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter wings, wrote in his combat diary in June 1943 that American escort fighters were changing the nature of the air war over Germany. He noted that Luftwaffe fighter pilots now faced a two-layer problem. They had to penetrate through the escort fighters to attack the bombers, then had to fight their way back out through the escorts during breakaway. The P-47's heavy armament made both phases extremely dangerous. Trautloft observed that the psychological impact on German pilots was severe. Young pilots joining fighter units in mid-1943 were flying into a combat environment far more lethal than what their instructors had experienced earlier in the war. The average life expectancy of a replacement pilot in a day fighter unit defending the Reich was measured in weeks. Many pilots were shot down during their first or second combat missions before they gained the experience necessary to survive. The attrition rate was unsustainable. German aircraft production could replace lost fighters, but Germany could not replace experienced pilots as quickly as they were being killed. Each veteran pilot shot down represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition, losing the institutional knowledge and tactical skill that had made it so effective earlier in the war. The quality of German fighter pilots was declining even as the number of enemy aircraft they faced continued to increase. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not solely responsible for this attrition, but its 850 caliber machine guns made it one of the most lethal fighter aircraft in the European theater. American pilots who mastered the aircraft became highly effective at shooting down German fighters. The Thunderbolt's speed in a dive, its ability to absorb battle damage, and its devastating armament made it a formidable opponent. German pilots, who had previously felt confident in their ability to outfight Allied fighters, now faced an opponent that was faster, better armed, and increasingly well-flown. One of the most successful American Thunderbolt pilots was Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. Johnson scored 27 confirmed aerial victories, all while flying P-47s, making him one of the leading American fighter aces in the European theater. His combat record illustrated how effective the Thunderbolt could be in the hands of a skilled pilot. Johnson's tactical approach emphasized using the Thunderbolt's strengths while avoiding prolonged turning combat where German fighters held advantages in maneuverability. He would typically position his flight of 4 Thunderbolts above and behind bomber formations, watching for German fighters assembling to attack. When German fighters committed to their attack runs, Johnson would roll into a diving attack, using altitude and speed to close rapidly. He would open fire at maximum effective range, typically 400 to 500 yards, and continue firing as he closed to point-blank range. The 850 caliber guns gave him sufficient ammunition to fire long bursts without concern for running out. The heavy weight of fire increased hit probability even during high-speed attacks where aiming was difficult. Johnson's wingman, Lieutenant Robert Rankin, described Johnson's gunnery technique in a post-war interview. He said Johnson would open fire earlier than most pilots, at ranges where other pilots thought accuracy was impossible, but Johnson understood that the Thunderbolt's 8 guns could put enough bullets into the air that some would hit even at extended range. Once he scored initial hits, he would adjust his aim based on tracer trajectory and close in for the kill. The technique required confidence in the aircraft's armament and a willingness to expend ammunition liberally, but it was devastatingly effective. On June 26, 1943, Robert Johnson experienced firsthand why German pilots respected the Thunderbolt's durability. His aircraft was attacked by German fighters while returning from an escort mission. Cannon and machine gun fire struck his Thunderbolt repeatedly, destroying much of the tail section, damaging the engine, and wounding Johnson in several places. The aircraft was so badly damaged that Johnson considered bailing out, but the P-47 continued flying despite catastrophic structural damage. Johnson managed to fly his crippled aircraft across the English Channel and belly-landed at his home base in England. When ground crews examined the wreck, they counted more than 200 bullet and shell holes. The rudder was nearly destroyed. Large portions of the tail section were missing. The engine had multiple cylinders damaged. But the aircraft had flown for over an hour in this condition and brought its pilot home alive. German pilots who heard about heavily damaged Thunderbolts returning to base began to understand that the aircraft was extraordinarily difficult to shoot down. Even when they scored what should have been fatal hits, the Thunderbolt often survived. This durability was the result of deliberate design decisions by Republic Aviation. The radial engine could lose multiple cylinders and continue producing power. The fuel tanks were self-sealing and protected by armor plate. The pilot was protected by armor from front and rear. The airframe structure used heavy forgings and thick aluminum skin that could absorb significant battle damage without catastrophic failure. Control cables were redundant where possible. The hydraulic system included backup provisions. Every component was designed with the assumption that the aircraft would be hit by enemy fire and needed to continue functioning despite damage. But it was the armament that German pilots feared most. The ability to absorb damage kept American pilots alive, but the 8 50 caliber machine guns killed German pilots. Throughout the summer and fall of 1943, Luftwaffe losses to American escort fighters mounted steadily. By September, some Luftwaffe fighter units were losing more aircraft to P-47 Thunderbolts than to all other causes combined. The tactical situation had reversed from earlier in the war. Now it was German pilots who were being hunted by superior numbers of enemy fighters with better performance and heavier armament. Josef Wurmheller continued flying combat missions throughout 1943, but his personal victory total grew more slowly than it had earlier in the war. The easy victories against unescorted bombers were gone. Every mission now involved fighting through escort fighters. The stress and danger increased with each sortie. In January 1944, Wurmheller was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Germany's highest military decorations, for his achievements as a fighter pilot. By that time, he had 93 confirmed victories. But the award came with a price. High-scoring pilots were kept in combat longer than others because their experience was too valuable to lose. They flew mission after mission, while casualties among less experienced pilots remained catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's day fighter force was being destroyed through attrition. Replacement pilots arriving at operational units had minimal training and almost no combat experience. They were thrown into action against veteran American fighter pilots flying superior aircraft. The learning curve was steep and deadly. Many replacement pilots were shot down during their first combat missions. Those who survived a few missions became slightly more capable, but they still lacked the experience necessary to compete on equal terms with American pilots who had been flying combat missions for months. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially lost the daylight air war over Germany. American bomber formations escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and later by P-51 Mustangs with even longer range could strike targets deep inside Germany with relative impunity. German fighter defenses inflicted casualties but could not prevent the bombers from reaching their targets. The industrial capacity of the Reich was being systematically destroyed from the air. On June 26, 1944, Josef Wurmheller was killed in combat. He was attacking an American bomber formation when his Focke-Wulf 190 was hit by defensive fire from a B-17. The aircraft caught fire and Wurmheller crashed near Altenburg in northwestern Germany. He was 25 years old and had achieved 102 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the most successful German fighter pilots of the war. He did not live to see Germany's defeat, which by mid-1944 was inevitable. The P-47 Thunderbolt continued flying combat missions over Europe until the end of the war in May 1945. By that time, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built. The aircraft had served in every theater where American forces fought. In the European theater alone, P-47 pilots claimed over 5,000 aerial victories against German aircraft. The actual number was likely somewhat lower due to overclaiming, which was common among all air forces during the war. But the Thunderbolt's contribution to Allied air superiority was undeniable. The aircraft shot down more German fighters than it destroyed ground targets, contrary to popular perception. While the Thunderbolt became famous for the ground attack missions in the later stages of the war, its primary role through 1943 and much of 1944 was bomber escort and fighter-versus-fighter combat. In this role, the 8 50 caliber machine guns proved decisive. German fighter pilots who survived the war and wrote memoirs or gave interviews consistently mentioned the P-47's overwhelming firepower. General Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces from late 1941 through January 1945, wrote in his memoir that American escort fighters, particularly the P-47 and later the P-51, were the decisive factor in the air war over Germany. He stated that once American fighters could escort bombers all the way to their targets and back, the Luftwaffe could no longer prevent the destruction of Germany's war industry. Galland specifically mentioned the P-47's armament in his analysis. He noted that the 850 caliber guns gave American pilots overwhelming firepower advantage in fighter versus fighter combat. German pilots, using cannons, had to score precise hits to achieve kills. American pilots, with 8 machine guns, could fire longer bursts and score multiple hits even with less precise aim. The psychological impact was significant. German pilots knew that even a brief burst from a Thunderbolt could destroy their aircraft. The intelligence failure that led Luftwaffe analysts to initially assess the P-47 as carrying only 6 guns rather than 8 was a relatively minor error in the grand scheme of the war. It did not change the strategic outcome. Germany would have lost the air war over Europe regardless of whether Luftwaffe intelligence correctly assessed Thunderbolt armament in early 1943. But the error illustrated a broader problem in German intelligence capabilities during the war. As the conflict progressed, German intelligence became less accurate and less timely. Information about Allied capabilities took longer to reach operational units. Analysis was often based on incomplete data or wishful thinking rather than hard evidence. German commanders made tactical and strategic decisions based on flawed intelligence assessments that underestimated Allied capabilities and overestimated German strengths. The misassessment of P-47 armament was symptomatic of these larger problems. Luftwaffe intelligence should have determined the correct armament configuration within days of the aircraft's first combat appearance. Instead, it took weeks of combat reports from multiple units before the assessment was corrected. That delay meant German pilots flew missions with inaccurate understanding of the threats they faced. Some German pilots paid for that intelligence failure with their lives. They engaged P-47 fighters, expecting to face an opponent armed with 6 guns, comparable to British fighters they had encountered. Instead, they faced 8 guns that produced overwhelming volumes of fire. The surprise was tactical rather than strategic, but in air combat, tactical surprises are often fatal. A pilot who misunderstands his opponent's capabilities makes incorrect tactical decisions. Those decisions can result in positions of disadvantage from which escape is impossible. The broader lesson from the P-47 story is about the importance of accurate intelligence and the dangers of assumptions based on expected patterns rather than observed reality. German intelligence analysts assumed American fighters would follow British design patterns because that assumption seemed reasonable. British and American aircraft often shared similar design philosophies, but the assumption was wrong. American designers had chosen a different approach to fighter armament, and that choice had significant tactical consequences. In warfare, assumptions are dangerous. Intelligence must be based on verified observation rather than expectations. When intelligence is wrong, soldiers die. The German pilots who encountered P-47 Thunderbolts in the spring of 1943 learned this lesson in the most direct and painful way possible. They expected to face an opponent comparable to other Allied fighters. They discovered they were fighting an aircraft with unprecedented firepower. That discovery came too late for some of them. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stands as one of the most significant fighter aircraft of World War II. Its combination of high-altitude performance, long-range, heavy armament, and exceptional durability made it ideally suited for the strategic air campaign against Germany. The 850 caliber machine guns that German intelligence initially miscounted proved to be one of the aircraft's most important features. Those guns gave American pilots the firepower needed to destroy German fighters in combat and protect bomber formations from interception. The Luftwaffe never developed an effective counter to American escort fighters. German industry produced new fighter designs with improved performance, but none could overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting outnumbered against well-trained opponents flying excellent aircraft. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. A few elite units continued flying missions, but they could not reverse the tide of the air war. Germany's skies belonged to the Allies, the industrial cities of the Ruhr, the oil refineries that supplied fuel to German forces, the transportation networks that moved supplies to the front, all were destroyed from the air. The strategic bombing campaign did not win the war by itself. Ground forces still had to invade and defeat German armies in the field, but air superiority made that ground campaign possible. Without control of the air, the D-Day invasion of Normandy would have failed. German armored forces could have concentrated against the beachheads and thrown the Allies back into the sea. Allied tactical air power prevented that concentration and enabled the breakout that eventually led to Germany's defeat. The P-47 Thunderbolt played a central role in achieving that air superiority. From early 1943, when it first appeared over Europe, until the end of the war, the Thunderbolt was one of the primary American fighters defending bomber formations and attacking German aircraft. Its 850 caliber machine guns destroyed thousands of German fighters and killed or wounded thousands of German pilots. That attrition ground down the Luftwaffe's combat capability until German forces could no longer effectively resist Allied air operations. German pilots like Josef Wurmheller, who fought against the Thunderbolt, recognized its capabilities through bitter experience. They respected the aircraft's firepower, its durability, and the skill of the pilots who flew it. That respect was earned through combat, through seeing what 850 caliber machine guns could do to a Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitt, through experiencing the overwhelming volume of fire that a Thunderbolt could produce. The initial intelligence failure that assessed the P-47 as carrying only 6 guns was corrected relatively quickly through operational experience. But by the time German pilots fully understood what they were facing, the tactical situation had already shifted decisively against them. The Luftwaffe was fighting a losing battle against numerical superiority, better aircraft, better logistics, and pilots who were gaining experience, while German experience was being attrited away. The story of German pilots discovering that the P-47 carried 8 guns instead of 6 is ultimately a small footnote in the larger history of World War II, but it illustrates how intelligence failures, even relatively minor ones, can have tactical consequences. It shows how assumptions based on expectations rather than evidence can lead to dangerous miscalculations, and it demonstrates that in air combat, where engagements are measured in seconds and mistakes are often fatal, accurate information about enemy capabilities is essential for survival. For the German pilots who encountered P-47 Thunderbolts in combat, the discovery that the aircraft carried 850 caliber machine guns rather than 6 was a revelation that came through direct, often fatal experience. They learned through being attacked, through seeing the overwhelming volume of fire, through watching squadron mates shot down by American fighters they had underestimated. That education was expensive. It was paid for in lives and aircraft, and ultimately it came too late to change the outcome of the air war over Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.